played a this ransom note. The call came from patrol response. She made the statement that her husband had left, had not returned home, and she had stuffed in the front of her door essentially a ransom note, $20,000 for his. Don't call the police. See him back safe. I think it said call his pager. She calls and we'll call you back.
Warning: the podcast and graphic descriptions of and adult language is advised.
Podcast: The Murder, Part 1.
To the Murder Police Podcast.
David.
How are you doing today?
We've got.
I do. We're talking about the 1990 Nuckolls, and we have with us sergeants with Paul Williams and Billy Richmond. You today?
Great.
For being here, Paul.
Everybody, I'm better than I'm look, but
thank you both for. Don't you tell us a little bit about yourself? Tell us about your career with Lexington up to until you reached.
In I was 21 years old, academy, and had the good fortune of being around. Had an opportunity to work in areas that had really had some good policemen and people in the community, and to be effective and everything. So I ended up contacts, obviously. When I left to patrol, I went to third shift. Caught a murder suspect and proudly took him back to the Sergeant Dan Gibbons, who's the guy we knew at the police department. Suspect back along, I was a recruit officer with me. We caught his buddy too. Pretty good about myself, and over to Dan Gibbons, and Gibbons had a different, ended up with that case, and I knew nothing about. I was temporarily assigned to a unit for a few weeks, the homicide from that work over off South. So with that, I gained some new knowledge and desire whatsoever to stay with the. So I begged my way back to my regular life work. Ultimately, Gibbons, I got called out when I thought it was a joke. I'm not on call. Gibbons specifically said he wanted me to. So that kind of started several. I ended up over what I thought was assigned to, along with that. Not only the assault cases, we did child abuse at that time, elderly abuse, so cases and heavier was more. That turned into basically a 7 to 7.5 homicide unit.
You didn't get good, did you?
So as my career went on, I went to the years, basically felony warrants and murder suspects, your bank, kind of the worst of the worst people. And then really not my plan, but I took because many of my buddies were kind of shamed into it. And Paul took both of us got promoted, so leaving the Marshal's Task Force, the third shift patrol for several special ops over in traffic where I was in November. So I've been retired now from. All I can say is it was 30 years, a job that I'd do over. I miss it thoroughly. You're working with people like David, like Paul Williams for cases, and but no, he had a great that had so many different areas. I think one genius in the bunch, so to speak. We were pretty because somebody had some act, and that's what made. Strong group of pieces, and we worked in quite success several years that it was always a pleasure to work.
I'm going to chime in on two things. One is my favorite time in 2084. I have a collection of badges, and it means the most is the one that we all share sincerely. Second, everything you said about Dan Gibbons, TDY, after Billy, and it wasn't because of where it went and what it was in my career could. And Dan, just an amazing guy. He's actually when we started a couple of years ago.
Trent did your case with us.
Something that the audience knows we tell them what it's been like for them to get to hear, but and her jaws hurt from in the room together. Joking, we could have started a podcast, but it's probably better to enough names to change. I mean, it's the way it is. But I had to jump in and working for people like Dan, and it's nothing ever in my career again. So sorry. Why
don't you tell us how you got it and how long you stayed?
My story's a little different than Billy's. He started when he was 3. Prior to this, to work for the University of Veterinary Science and an electron microscope and a virus. The thing that kind of fascinated me, I had a cousin that was for a ride-along one weekend. Found it kind of adventuresome. That's probably something convinced I was smarter than my cousin. So police department, and I started off on patrol. I think Billy mentioned homicide as was my primary focus. Outdoorsman, I've enjoyed hunting, kind of like the ultimate hunt, to be able to stalk that quarry. I just kind of pointed myself, and I had been on about 14 shift because the action was, we had the homicides. At one point, and I'll second as he was a sergeant, and I got as a heavy run of homicides. They wanted some to fill the ISIS. Let me clarify them as that way, but assigned to that while the detectives come with the hot After that exposure, I decided and applied. They pushed me along for that and ended up there after I got to go anywhere else. 14 years, I retired and have been living the glory days, and I don't have any desire to go. I'm with things. I'm satisfied to leave that to somebody else. Enough trouble getting quiet, and I'm just not sure that it would be as rewarding. So I've kind of strike out with other things. I miss the people. Just getting called out in the middle of the night. Soccer games, the children that you're trying to used to be good people and loved it. I'm glad that that's what I did, but it's time to.
Yeah, at some point, another person's game.
You leave high school, it's behind you. It's behind you. You've got to focus there.
Very interesting. Thank you all. You did put in there. I aided by homicide and everything. This case I research a lot of, so are because I'm interested in this case summary. So about this case before we dive in apart, so to speak.
Yeah, I'll let Paul was the case. Paul.
We got a notification report of a kidnapping. Lexington, a relatively new. It's not something that involves a ransom note related to some other ancillary that or whatnot. This was a ransom note. The call came from patrol responds. The statement that her husband had been out, had left, had not returned, and she had found stuffed in the front of her door a ransom note, $20,000 for his return. Don't call the police and come back safe. You'll. I think it said call his pager, stand, and we'll call you back. They find the note, back to us. We come out to start and try to figure out what initially was I haven't checked on him. He was mid-60s at this, and the wife was the same age. Long time. Sonship was sister than husband and lived at a home with her who was in caregiver. His finances and his property, which were in a storage unit. There was some in her relationship with that it was a straight up. She was concerned that it was money. She was a little concerned. Roof that money, some past that, played a part in. He was convinced that he was gone.
Paul, I remember when we talked, he was somewhat different when you kind of gauge him and if they're being truthful or how much you interject in something else. And she was a bit, I remember at first questioning true reality of it, because it was such an odd thing, a kidnapping case, the flow of information. You had to pay attention to
disjointed to some, had to do with the distance in the relationship between her and the husband. She's around. Nuckolls had been federal time, I believe, trafficking in marijuana. He was a firefighter and then a course of income was he was a leaseman, secured oil and gas leases, primarily rural areas but investigation, we found that initiation was folks in West Virginia. He was several of them were on it had to do with check fraud. There was another subject on drug charges that we started going through his phones and things like that. Recently indicted. West Virginia that were indicted were service that had to do with counterfeiting. Check some inclination that he may have been a in what had happened to reportedly now. Why would someone? How would they know that, to pay the ransom? A number of questions we weren't. And this was in charge of care of her father, who suffered from dementia. That's in his property. She actually may have been in to money.
I think Mr. Nuckolls had by his own beard from things that he did at some point. I don't remember exactly when, but she felt like he was kind of a con man. I think that when we started in our minds, like Paul, is he making himself disappear?
Her dad's money.
So is he a part of that? That's the only way he can come. Because she was a good custodian.
Well, I'll tell you, listening to a few things, I'm picking up on it too, because it'll go in a minute to how you got notified. But this is definitely a mysterious possible motivators that come into the case. You'll work through those, but very carefully too is when the wife. I remembered how many people that were directly involved, but they don't do this for a living, understanding characteristics with people. Things in the interview room or getting that weird feeling on, and it doesn't turn out to be anything. Sometimes all of us, probably there was enough of that strange behavior that it almost deviated. You all agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely.
It was warranted.
Yeah.
I mean, on what happened to such and such, and you just go to anything I've ever heard or encountered. You see what that is, and the more you find that that, it's fabricated or it's.
And then sometimes we haven't dealt with them before.
Yeah. If you've ever run into suffers some, and it can go from minimal, for example, as autistic, means a failure by any other people, such as the movie Rain, or your form of autism, and you run into, and it's got to socially interact with people. Weird, totally motivated to do what normal, or you got to realize that like yours and different people, and you've got to wade into how much of their story.
It strikes me like opinion now to get things, and we see statements, and one of the biggest criticisms is victim that's disappeared, and they don't act like they're grieving. That weird, but again, until you learn that you're this piece, and again, how
you can overread it, and you can
very unique. As you start out with a body, when we didn't have a body and that made it. I think Paul, and of course I won't mention got a missing persons case on 2.5 years of domestic violence she was an older lady in her 60s. And all along I thought she was, and I worked that case. I worked in states of contacting people, contacted their family, and find enough that one day I'm going to let you meet her and terrified because her husband, it's probably not going to end well. He's going to kill her if he ever found her. When that case lady, how bizarre is that? It's like this. It is supposed to be missing to your head. Again, is by their own accord as well. And until we actually found the body and ghosts to some.
And I want to interject this. We can expound on it later or bring it back. The thing, homicide cases that interesting to me, case, and you have a guy and you have missing. Is that an impetus for, is it a motive or is he linked? Is he off girlfriend? Is he off some nefarious money? No, but you have to not form. You have to go scientific background. I thought, we were trying to, you didn't move to conclusion facts that you could repeat this in most of my investigation. And this kind of a primary situation like that, and you can't let your feelings or your ID you to doing something and you put it on a second, because critical in these cases, you information as soon as you can, lose it. So investigation, I don't think that's what a lot of it, every piece of information, you have to set it up and go, this is not true. And you do the same thing or question, this possible, is it true? Verify that. Requires that. Phone calls you've got, and we got into his phone bills, contacting people that were in contact with timeline.
He was into a lot of things. And gas, enterprise horses. He owned a couple of, he was very involved with those.
Scrap someone else he had a deal going with a bunch of used tires.
He was very interactive, is what I'm getting at.
About victimology and risk. That's what I hit on in the beginning. It'd be tough because all of those, like maybe a drug dealer, but they are cloud.
Well, and then you have to interject.
Yeah, there we go.
And this is a trafficking narcotics still involved. Who's he involved for? He's moving. He was in and out of the state. So
he had just taken a job had to do with transporting vehicles from Cincinnati and returning. So I don't know if there's somebody had just applied for. They're looking at somebody that's been, on the side. Well, shoot, car job between low dates is a great hark. A little suspicious.
Hey, there's more to this episode like the true crime fan.
The Murder Police are Wendy and David Lyons of Crime Victims. So it is produced, recorded. The Murder Police podcast can be found on your favorite Apple or Android podcast platform, as well as at murderpolicepodcast.com, where you will find show notes, transcripts, information about our presenters, and a link to the official Murder Police Podcast merch store, where you can purchase a huge variety of Murder Police Podcast swag. We are also on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube, which is closed caption for those that are hearing impaired. Just search for the Murder Police Podcast and you will find us. If you have enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe for more and give us 5 stars and a written review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you download your podcasts. Make sure you set your player to automatically download new episodes so you get the new ones as soon as they drop. And please tell your friends. Lock it down, Judy.